Thanks, everybody. My name's Alan Stevens, and I was one of the organizing committee for this conference. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the last session of this historical materialism conference. We had something like 475 people in attendance, and I want to thank you all for the incredibly exciting session. It was a great discussion, a great presentation. I really want to thank the volunteers and organizers, and in particular I want to thank Sarah Carpenter, who played a really important role in these organizing volunteers. And David McNally, who's been sleepless since about January. At the Toronto Historical Materialism, I think we've tried to design the conference, and we welcome feedback and getting succeeded in this, not only as a showcase of some of the best of historical materialist analysis that's out there, but also as a critical engagement with some of the many blind spots and silences that are there in much historical materialist analysis. The way that whiteness, masculinity, nationalism, heterosexism, and colonialism have actually often framed historical materialist analysis is something that we seriously need to address in conferences like this. And we've tried to design a conference that will address some of that. It's a great honor to end on a note that I think will continue this work of addressing historic blind spots in a great deal of historical materialist analysis and showing how historical materialism can contribute to the resources for addressing those blind spots as well as reproducing them at times. So we've got three speakers today who made important contributions in challenging those silences in areas of indigeneity, understanding whiteness and whiteness studies and anti-racism, and have done that in many ways in relation to historical materialism. So it's really exciting to have this session.
On such a beautiful day. And thanks to the organizers. The paper that I'm going to give is short. It has a little tiny epigraph, and it's going to try to get at some of what Professor Esch and I are doing in this book, but then particularly in a kind of a current events way and a theory way. We're historians mainly, but I'm going to talk a little bit about history, but mostly about what drives this work at this moment for us, and then a little bit about theory. The epigraph is from a chapter of a book that I don't like very much, but I love the quote. So the quote is from Emanuel Wallerstein in the book that he did with Balabar on Nation and Race. And it goes like this: "It is one thing to ask whence universalist doctrine and how widely it is shared, or to ask why racism and sexism exist and persist. It is quite another to inquire into the pairing of two ideologies." Doesn't quite work grammatically. The pairing of the two ideologies. Indeed, one might argue what has been the symbiotic relationship of these presumed opposites. So the presumed opposites are racism and sexism on the one hand and universalism on the other. And Wallerstein is suggesting that there's this riddle here of the persistence of both at the same time. And I think in trying to penetrate that riddle, or what David's calling a mystery, we tend to assume that the productive process produces the universalism, and the rest, off the job, the neighborhood, the primordial, the whatever people call it, produces the persistence of racism and sexism. That in Chakrabarty's terms, that I'm skipping a long section on Chakrabarty in this paper, but the history one logic of capital stuff is what produces abstraction and universalism as its goal. But at the same time, there's a history two that he doesn't really talk about very much that can introduce some complications, and that the racism and the sexism are those complications. So what we're trying to suggest is that in actually getting out production every day, the reproduction of racism and sexism is important in at least historically and in the present in the U.S. capitalist economy. And not just to decrease union power, or not just to depress wages, but in the actual extraction of production that racialized bodies are what gets managed in many cases. So our book is to try to take seriously the cartoon that some of you have and some of you will have seen in Historical Materialism, IWW cartoon, which makes the key to management, Mr. Block, the block-headed worker in this cartoon, is being managed in all of his different racial and nationality guises against other races and nationalities. And not in the same situation. The anti-penultimate panel and the penultimate panel introduced the kind of hyper-oppression and vulnerability to complete expelling from the workplace of the nation of black and Asian workers. But there's this continuum in which workers and their masculinities in this cartoon are managed by a clever boss in order to get production out, not just around the question of abstraction and to get the same motion done, and we don't care what kind of body does that motion, but very much around what kind of body does that motion. So our book tries to rewrite the history of management from settler colonialism and slavery forward, rather than from factory forward in the way that it's always written by labor historians and management historians in the United States. And the one historical thing I'll say beyond that is that there are some real surprises. For example, in the section on slavery that begins the book, there's a giant managerial literature on slavery, including articles called The Scientific Management of Slaves. And that managerial literature has to be completely ignored by historians who want the history of management to begin in 1880 with the factory and with the university-based managerial programs. But we were interested at first in how you get the cotton produced. But it turns out that managerial literature is as much about the management of reproductive labor as it is about productive labor. And constantly the managerial literature says the profit is in the increase. It's the management to bring more slaves into the world and nurture them. So what looked like a question to us when we started about productivity and extraction of cotton production was the extraction of reproductive labor as well. And the justification in those managerial magazines, journals, for slavery was never just about white supremacy vis-a-vis Africans. It was also about justifying the settler colonial project that took over Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas, so that you'd have articles that were about the management of slaves and then about the management of land and the management of grapes and the management of cattle and the management of everything else. And on that, the settler colonial logic, the North agreed. So one of the tremendous hidden advantages of pro-slavery thought that I think people have not written about at all yet is that it dovetailed with the larger settler colonial project, and that it had a hearing for that reason, that it was able to claim the ability to manage land vis-a-vis better than native peoples who were there, and then also to know Africans and manage them, as Du Bois said. So let me talk for a couple minutes about the contemporary reasons that I think we got drawn to this project. We came to it thinking we came to it for scholarly reasons, but in fact, we've been paying a lot of attention, and I grew up near, and when Betsy was at Illinois, we both lived near a little town called Beardstown, Illinois, and its twin, smaller, still town called Rushville. And kind of a friend of ours, Paradak Garavtev, was working in these towns as an anthropologist, urbanist. And what was going on there, and what was going on in the Iowa packing towns where there's so many titanic immigration struggles now and so much diversity all of a sudden, was something that really registered with both of us, I think. So let me just read a short section. Not long ago, Beardstown, Illinois, and nearby Rushville were sundown towns. law enforcement, community practice, and according to oral history, a stark signboard warning off black visitors combined to keep African Americans out of the west central Illinois river towns after dark. The area's meatpacking industry, anchored in an Oscar Mayer factory, provided jobs to many of the white workers in the two towns when I was growing up. After Oscar Mayer decided to abandon the area in 1986, Beardstown courted the Cargill Corporation to run a giant pork processing plant, actually the same plant that Oscar Mayer had abandoned, attracting it with big tax breaks, a free enterprise zone, and a wage cut of over 25%. A much chastened union, it's a unionized plant, was willing to allow a tremendous speed up on the pork processing line. At first, jobs went to local workers at about 2/3 of the wages, big wage cut, and a speed up, including some former Oscar Mayer workers. Beardstown Mayor Bob Walters, a ham owner at Oscar Mayer and a longtime Food Commercial Workers Union representative, took pride in keeping the jobs for Americans, but not for African Americans. Hispanics and blacks, he warned, quote, undermined labor standards. A few workers of color tried Beardstown through 1989. As one white worker told a reporter, quote, there was very few colors and very few Mexicans. Every time we tried to tell them to do something, they'd look at us stupid, so we'd start harassing them, and they'd quit. So the sundown town logic continued to apply to black workers and now to Mexican workers. But the very brutality of the factory ironically did the work of multiculturalism. With a hog being killed now every 4.5 seconds instead of every 6 seconds, the union had allowed this, repetitive stress injuries and accidents sent labor turnover to 100% annually, and by the mid-1990s, as workers' comp claims skyrocketed, Latino and African immigration suddenly accelerated into Beardstown as meatpacking became what Human Rights Watch has called the most dangerous United States factory job. Reuters recently explained to its transnational audience, quote, a large portion of the U.S. meat industry workers are immigrants, mainly Hispanics, filling positions that involve fast-paced and dirty work, end quote. By 2006, Cargill Meat Solutions, that's the wonderful name of the plant, Cargill Meat Solutions slaughtered 18,000 hogs daily there and its twin plant, exactly twin plant in Ottumwa, Iowa. One hog now every 3 seconds, with a Beardstown workforce that was suddenly nearly half immigrant, aggressively recruited multinational. The corporation universalized labor and turned it into motions made frantic and standard and abstract in a series of cold factories. Ottumwa or Beardstown, West African or Mexican worker, Honduran or Illinois farm boy, the abstract labor, as Marx would have it, was interchangeable. And yet Cargill sought not just impoverished workers, but divided ones. French-speaking West and Central Africans, mostly Togolese, but also Senegalese, Congolese, Burkinabe, and Beninois, make up 10% of Rushville's 3,000 residents all of a sudden. Still no African Americans in the town, but a huge African population in Rushville. Cargill's Latino workers, largely Mexican, but also Dominican, Cuban, Central Americans, outnumber Africans at the plant by 4 to 1. Vietnamese and Filipino workers also labor at Cargill. Language, French, Spanish, Tagalog, English, religion, and perceived legal status, with Mexican workers sometimes without documentation and Africans, typically immigration lottery winners, further divide workers. In April 2000, immigration authorities dramatically raided the plant, arresting over 60 workers employed by a sanitation services subcontractor, essentially Cargill with a different hat on. Africans processed some of their grievances regarding pace, danger, bathroom breaks, and the incredible cold in the factory as a problem with more experienced black, white, and Latino workers and supervisors, even as remarkable solidarities develop in and out of work. Beardstown all of a sudden is a soccer power, a football power in Illinois, out of this collaboration of Mexican kids and West African kids. But the company continues to send labor recruiters, and Illinois' unemployment is 12%, 15%, but it continues to send labor recruiters to far-flung world areas of high unemployment, especially recently to Puerto Rico, introducing a group of workers with yet another relation to the state and state power. The world system has fully found its way into the sundown towns. Indeed, recently some African workers wanting out or pushed out of Beardstown have ended in the even colder confines of salmon processing factory ships off the coast of Alaska. So one moment you're in Congo, you win the immigration lottery, then you're in central Illinois, you think that's the coldest possible place in the world. You get on the wrong side of your foreman, and the foreman says, oh, you want to continue to work for Cargill, you have to go off to the coast of Alaska. Now, that doubling of pace was achieved in very much the same way that Mr. Block fell victim to in the cartoon that's before you. It's not just a matter of having a glutted labor market, but it's a matter of having a labor market that's glutted with people in all sorts of different and contradictory relations to the state and to legality. Now, to close, I want to just say that we try to think that this new situation, which is true in the management of hotel workers in the United States, of restaurant workers in the United States, Nick DiGenova shows in a wonderful Marxist work of factory workers in Chicago, in the United States, and in the world, in Dubai, in construction, in the way that the U.S. Army provisions itself now. You have this same kind of pattern of bringing the workers of the world in and letting them kind of chew up each other and be managed against each other. And out of that, I think that we're starting to see some theorists begin to take account of this. And I'm not going to talk about Chakrabarty because I think he doesn't get very far in taking account of it, although his account of abstract labor, whatever other things are wrong, is valuable. But I want to talk about Michael Leibowitz, the Canadian economist, just a tiny bit. Leibowitz goes a considerable way towards thinking through this problem. Though self-consciously working from within a Marxist tradition more than Chakrabarty, Leibowitz finds in Marx a gap not only underdeveloped but missing entirely from the central sections of Capital. In lecturing in 2005 on his receiving of the prestigious Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize for Marxist Scholarship, Leibowitz argued that what is missing in Marx's most celebrated accounts of capital's relations to labor is another unnamed variable. Chakrabarty's got his own unnamed variables. Which Leibowitz calls the X factor. Leibowitz insists on locating X as, quote, part of the essence of capital, indeed an essential aspect of the logic of capital, end quote. He defines X as, quote, the tendency to divide workers. Leibowitz allowed that X was something Marx, quote, recognized well, for example, in discussions of the antagonism between the Irish and English workers, and in discussions of the southern United States. But Leibowitz is firm and frank in holding that divisions among the working class, specifically racism and sexism, quote, do not appear as part of the essence of capital in Marx's Capital, end quote. Leibowitz then learnedly explains why. Capital's tendencies toward, quote, the centralizing, uniting, and organizing the working class, end quote, exist on this view as in tension with, quote, the importance to capital of dividing workers. So much is this the case that even as capital seeks productivity, which Leibowitz calls Q, it includes the X factor in its calculus. What matters, he concludes, is not productivity, but the relationship between productivity and the degree of separation, Q over X. Thus, where working class universalism is concerned, he writes, quote, capital encourages the development of the collective worker in itself, but has no interest in the emergence of the collective worker for itself. And in fact, we would say rather the opposite. Let me give you then two more quotes to close that also inspire our work and give us some kind of sense that people working within and near a Marxist tradition are beginning to try to puzzle out how it is that we see this recrudescence, although it never really went away, of what we're calling race management. Lisa Lowe, the great cultural studies theorist, in her book Immigrant Acts, demonstrates powerfully why Marxism is indispensable and why too much of Marxist scholarship has been, quote, slow to apprehend the specific history of the United States, where race, gender, capital, and class are concerned. Lowe argues that Marxism has too often stopped for allowing for race-making processes like the slave trade and the seizing of native land only in an early period of primitive accumulation. Though race-making, she argues, continued to matter greatly in the longer history of capitalism. She insisted in the world's most developed capitalist nation, the connection of race and exploitation persisted and ramified, driving the accumulation of capital and shaping strategies for rule. Quote, in the United States, in the history of the United States, capital has maximized its profits not only through rendering labor abstract, but precisely through the social productions of difference, marked by race, nation, geographical origins, and gender, end quote. Lowe's follower, the anthropologist Paul Silverstein, settles on the term, following her, socially disunited abstract labor as the contradictory but not unproductive desire of capital. Thanks.